The winter after Pearl Harbor felt different in Washington. The city moved with urgency, but underneath the urgency was something closer to fear. The United States had entered the largest war in human history, and the Navy that was supposed to guard 2 oceans had just been humiliated in a single morning. Battleships lay burning in Hawaii. Aircraft lay twisted on runways. Across the Pacific, Japanese fleets moved almost wherever they wanted. Inside the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the country didn't just need ships. It needed a man capable of forcing the Navy to fight again. And the man he chose frightened almost everyone who worked with him. Admiral Ernest J. King had a reputation that followed him like a storm cloud. Officers who had served under him described conversations as combat exercises. Junior commanders approached his office the way sailors approached unexploded bombs, slowly, carefully, and hoping nothing would suddenly go wrong. Roosevelt once joked that King shaved every morning with a blowtorch. It sounded like humor, but the men who worked with the admiral understood it as something closer to a warning. King never tried to soften that image. In fact, he cultivated it. Shortly after the disaster at attack on Pearl Harbor, reporters gathered to hear the Navy's new commander speak. They expected reassurances. They expected calm words about rebuilding the fleet. Instead, King looked at them and made something very clear. He told them that somebody in the Navy had to be the tough one. Someone had to make decisions nobody liked. Someone had to force the service to fight harder than it ever had before. And then he told the reporters that person was him. The statement wasn't arrogance. It was a declaration of war against complacency. But to understand how Ernest King became the most feared officer in the American military, you have to go back decades before the war, back to a quiet town on the edge of Lake Erie. King was born in 1878 in the industrial town of Lorraine. His father worked long hours as a railroad foreman, a job that demanded discipline and toughness. His mother came from a family connected to the British naval dockyards, and the household was strict in the way many late 19th century homes were strict. Rules were expected to be followed. Opinions were expected to be honest. That honesty appeared early. At a dinner party when he was still a boy, King was served pie he didn't like. When the hostess asked what he thought of it, the young boy answered bluntly that it tasted terrible. His mother scolded him immediately for the rudeness. But the boy refused to apologize. He said it was true, and if something was true, he didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. That simple moment captured something about Ernest King that never changed. He believed honesty mattered more than politeness. If he disagreed with someone, he said so. If he thought an idea was foolish, he said that too. For the rest of his life, that habit would make him both respected and deeply disliked. King entered the United States Naval Academy in the late 19th century, a time when the American Navy was beginning to transform itself from a coastal defense force into a global power. He graduated near the top of his class, proving himself intellectually brilliant and intensely driven. But even then, the personality that would define him was already visible. Young officers are expected to follow rules, maintain discipline, and respect the chain of command. King had trouble with several of those expectations. During his early assignments in the Pacific, he drank heavily, socialized with enlisted sailors in bars, and developed a reputation for bluntness that sometimes crossed into outright insubordination. At one point, his behavior nearly ended his career. Reports reached senior commanders describing drinking, confrontations with superiors, and behavior considered unbecoming of an officer. The Navy considered dismissing him entirely. For a young officer in the early 1900s, that would have meant humiliation and the permanent end of any naval career. But something unusual happened. When King appeared before the board deciding his future, one of the senior admirals saw something beneath the trouble. He saw a sharp mind, relentless ambition, and an officer who might become exceptional if he learned to control himself. King was allowed to stay. The experience changed him. He later admitted that after that moment he made a conscious decision about what kind of officer he wanted to become. If the Navy demanded discipline, he would be the most disciplined man in it. If the Navy required toughness, he would be tougher than anyone else. Over time, he reshaped his personality with the same determination he applied to naval strategy. He would not simply be a competent officer. He would be the hardest one in the room. His rise through the Navy during the early 20th century showed how effective that transformation was. King developed an unusual range of expertise that few officers ever matched. He served in surface ships, commanded submarines, and later qualified as a naval aviator, an extraordinary accomplishment for an officer already in his 40s. Flying fascinated him. At the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, he trained alongside younger pilots and pushed himself to master the new technology transforming naval warfare. Aviation was still experimental in those years, but King saw immediately how important it would become. Long before aircraft carriers dominated the oceans, he understood that air power would decide the future of naval battles. That foresight helped push his career forward. Eventually, he commanded the massive aircraft carrier USS Lexington, one of the largest warships afloat in the interwar years. The ship represented the future of the Navy, and King threw himself into the role with characteristic intensity. But the stories that followed him were rarely about calm professionalism. They were about excess. Officers remembered weekends where parties lasted until sunrise. There were rumors about drinking, about gambling, and about the admiral's enthusiasm for female company. Navy gossip traveled quickly, and King became the center of many stories, some exaggerated, some probably true. Strangely, none of it seemed to damage his reputation as a professional. Despite the scandals, his superiors recognized his abilities. He was brilliant at organizing fleets, ruthless about enforcing standards, and frighteningly intelligent when discussing naval strategy. By the late 1930s, he had reached the rank of admiral. And then the world exploded into war. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States Navy faced the worst crisis in its history. Battleships had been sunk or crippled. Aircraft were destroyed. The Pacific Fleet had been knocked flat in a matter of hours. But the Navy still possessed something extremely valuable. Aircraft carriers had survived. And a few officers understood exactly how to use them. One of those officers was Admiral Ernest King. Within weeks of the disaster, King was appointed commander of the entire U.S. fleet. Soon afterward, he also became Chief of Naval Operations, placing him in control of nearly every aspect of the Navy's wartime expansion. From his headquarters in Washington, he began rebuilding the fleet with relentless speed. Shipyards expanded across the country. Training programs multiplied. Factories turned out destroyers, submarines, and carriers in numbers that stunned even the admirals planning the war. King drove the process with terrifying intensity. Meetings with him became legendary. Officers presenting plans knew they had to be prepared. If they hesitated or showed uncertainty, King's temper could erupt without warning. Careers had been damaged by a single poorly prepared briefing. One officer later compared presenting to King with standing in front of a firing squad and wondering whether the rifles were loaded. Yet despite the fear he inspired, the system worked. Under King's leadership, the Navy exploded in size. The United States began launching ships faster than any nation in history. New fleets appeared in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Meanwhile, the war itself was turning. In June 1942, the American Navy achieved one of its most important victories during the Battle of Midway. Using intelligence breakthroughs and carrier aviation, U.S. forces ambushed a powerful Japanese fleet and destroyed 4 enemy carriers. The victory changed the entire course of the Pacific War. Behind the scenes, King's relentless push for aggressive operations played a role in making such victories possible. He believed that wars were won through offense, not caution. In his view, a fleet that simply defended itself would eventually lose. So he demanded constant pressure against Japan. The strategy produced brutal campaigns across the Pacific. Island battles erupted from Guadalcanal to the Central Pacific. Aircraft carriers clashed in enormous naval engagements. Submarines hunted Japanese shipping across thousands of miles of ocean. The scale of the conflict was staggering. By the middle of the war, the U.S. Navy had grown into a force of millions of sailors and thousands of ships. Coordinating such a machine required a commander capable of making rapid decisions under enormous pressure. King made those decisions daily. But his personality continued to create conflict at the highest levels of command. American generals sometimes found him impossible to work with. Allied commanders from Britain were often shocked by his bluntness. Strategic meetings could become heated arguments within minutes. During discussions with British leaders, King sometimes pushed aggressively for more resources to be directed toward the Pacific War against Japan rather than the European War against Germany. The disagreements became so intense that other commanders occasionally had to step in to calm the room. Even so, there was one important truth his critics could not deny. When the fighting began, King supported the operations fully. One officer who initially disliked him later admitted something surprising. Whenever assistance was needed, ships, supplies, planning support, King provided it immediately. Personal disagreements never prevented him from fighting the war. Beneath the anger and arrogance was a strategist who understood something crucial about global conflict. Winning required relentless effort. And by the final years of the war, the results were impossible to ignore. American carrier fleets swept across the Pacific. Japanese naval power collapsed under submarine attacks and airstrikes. One island after another fell to Allied forces. The Navy King helped rebuild was no longer recovering from defeat. It was dominating two oceans. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States Navy had become the largest naval force ever assembled. Thousands of ships, millions of sailors, and fleets capable of operating anywhere on Earth had emerged from the chaos that followed Pearl Harbor. King's role in building that force was undeniable. Even many of the officers who disliked him admitted his leadership had been decisive. Yet historians continue to argue about what that leadership really meant. Some view him as one of the greatest naval commanders in American history, a ruthless strategist who understood exactly what the war required. Others see something more troubling. They see a leader whose temper, harshness, and willingness to humiliate subordinates created a culture of fear that would not be acceptable in modern military organizations. Both interpretations contain truth. Ernest King was brilliant, driven, and extraordinarily effective. He was also difficult, intimidating, and often deeply unpleasant to work with. But perhaps the most revealing moment came near the end of the war. By regulation, King had reached the mandatory retirement age for naval officers. He wrote a short note informing President Roosevelt that his time in uniform might soon end. Roosevelt's reply was only a few words long. He asked why that should matter. The war wasn't over yet. And the president clearly believed the Navy still needed the hardest admiral it had. History rarely produces simple characters. Ernest King was not the calm hero of patriotic legend, nor was he merely the tyrant some critics described. He was something more complicated, a man who deliberately shaped himself into a weapon for the most destructive war the world had ever seen. When the United States needed someone to rebuild a shattered fleet, Roosevelt chose the one commander tough enough to do it. Whether that choice should inspire pride or discomfort is a question history still hasn't fully answered.